Happy Saturday. It's November 9th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker, back in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And before we get to the U.S. election, it turns out, Michael, other things did happen in the world this week. In Germany, another political crisis. Chancellor Olaf Scholz's coalition is coming undone after the firing of his finance minister, and it's going to take months to reconfigure. Meanwhile, in Scotland, a nurse has died after taking just 2 doses of Mounjaro, a weight loss drug similar to Ozempic, which is sure to have people on the Upper East Side scrambling. But first, Michael, airmail is sort of the antidote to all of the news of the day, except we need to talk briefly about the election.
Was it an election? Where would you like to begin?
I wish we just recorded ourselves digesting it all at Bar Pisolino the day after the election when we were drinking tea and I was mainlining peanut M&Ms.
Yes, for listeners at home, Ashley was passing through New York City. I said, let's meet for coffee. She shows up with her bag. She's like, want some peanut M&Ms? I'm like, no. And she just, is like gobbling them up like Pac-Man. Just, but maybe it was a little stress eating, I think, at that moment.
I've been doing a lot of stress eating this week, Michael. But, those peanut M&Ms, by the way, cost me $2.50 at CVS, which perhaps is part of the reason that we are in this mess. But it was a warm day in New York City, but our spirits were barren.
Well, I think like a lot of people, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, you were feeling different emotions. But here in New York City, it was very strangely muted immediately after the election, of course.
It was strange, though. I did see a guy walking through the West Village in a MAGA hat, like a young 20-something hip-looking dude, which frankly you wouldn't have seen in 2016, right? It's like we're much more resigned to this future. And Graydon Carter and Alessandra Stanley, our co-editors of Airmail, have a great take on it in The View from here this week.
Yeah, I think it's taking the kind of long look, which is, in some ways, the real challenge for Trump and for the potential threat to his second term is what sort of bedevils so many presidents in their second term, which is avoiding scandals and corruption and sometimes their own character, whether it's Richard Nixon or other presidents who sort of they think they want a second term, but it tends to be very difficult, right?
Yeah, and Trump is a guy who loves the pomp and circumstance and above all the winning. And so now that he has to actually roll up his sleeves and get down to work, we shall see what is accomplished. Anyway, lots more to come on that front. But Michael, first, we need to be the antidote to all of the political news today.
Exactly. We've got a good issue for you this week and a great episode. First, I'm sure you're all familiar with Stanley Kubrick's cinematic masterpiece, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Well, it's now been adapted for the London stage by the UK's master of satire, Armando Iannucci, and John Lahr will join us from London with his review. And finally, Emily Houghton joins us from New York City to tell us about the fashion item that has been a favorite of the doyens and uptown gents for the past 70 or so years, but suddenly is being snapped up by Gen Zers on the Lower East Side and even actors in Hollywood. Would you believe it's a delicate loafer with a tiny bow on it, known as the Belgian shoe? So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Is this so wrong that I want to start with Belgian shoes?
No, maybe it's just a way to sort of step lightly into the episode this week after the week we've had.
This is pure escapism, Michael. One of the things that Airmail does best. Emily Houghton is the founder of Clementina, which is a brand of women's tailoring, and she lives in New York City. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So Belgian shoes, not exactly a new thing. They've had a loyal and devoted following for decades, if not longer, but they're having a moment right now. How do you explain it?
It's true. They're really a prim shoe that have been around for so long, and we all kind of associate them with the Upper East Side and, private clubs. But we're seeing a younger generation wearing them, which is pretty interesting. And, you have this shoe that's famous for its little bow. And all of these young guys are starting to wear Belgians. So it's an interesting time. They're all starting to collect them and, kind of pine over the originals. And they're flying in from England and, going to the store on 55th Street, which is, so incognito and interesting. We're also seeing, so many other brands pop up that are kind of focused on, I would say lightly borrowing the style.
So Emily, take us inside the Belgian shoes brand. Are they actually Belgian?
They are made in Belgium, but originally it was actually Henry Bendel's nephew who introduced the style. And it was in the mid-50s, not to be confused with Henry Bendel himself, who created the famous store uptown. But it was actually his nephew who traveled to Belgium and became really inspired by seeing this style of shoe and the way that it was made. And it's made in this turn style where they're handmade and they're sewn and then turned inside out. And he brought that style back to New York, and it just became extremely popular with, sort of an uptown private club crowd. And it became this sort of unofficial weekend shoe. But he opened specifically the Belgian shoe shop on 55th Street in the mid-50s, and everything kind of went from there. And now it's run by his former business partner and his daughters.
Originally, though, these shoes were not meant to be worn outside, right? What was sort of the original intention, and how has that been appropriated?
They were created as house slippers, and very refined ones. And so, you kind of imagine everyone at home in these beautiful townhouses with their wonderful staff, and they wanted something a little more structured, a little more elevated, that really looked like a loafer at home, but had, a soft bottom, and they were not street shoes at all. So people were wearing them at home, and it was kind of like wearing Charvet pajamas, where if you wear them outside of the house, it's a real move. They're beautifully designed, beautifully made, and pretty expensive. And so all of a sudden, you had people who started wearing them outside of the house, and it was, a little rebellious. And then you have people like Glenn O'Brien who started, wearing them outside of the house, and people started having them sold, and Andy Warhol. And then you have this whole generation of, even skate kids on the Lower East Side now will add soles to the bottom and be wearing them outside. And it's a little punk rock.
So has the Upper East Side club set figured out that their favorite shoe has been appropriated by a cooler generation, or are they just blissfully shuffling along Madison Avenue cluelessly?
I would say the latter, as we might expect. Even I went into the Belgian shoe shop recently, and, you had these native Upper East Siders going from, they looked like they were coming from lunch at the Colony, and, silver-haired and beautiful coats, and, men in corduroys. And they're just, in there picking up, they're kind of refreshing their collections. And there are celebrities in the shop as well. And I don't think that, any of the locals were paying any attention or had any idea who they were or what was going on.
Do you think there's any opportunity among the Belgian Shoes brand to grow their presence and make their online, start wholesaling? Or do you think they want to just keep it small in order to preserve the mystique?
It's really quite a phenomenon. We're in this time where everyone is, overwhelmed with advertising and information and influencers and everything else. And here's a shoe that is more popular than, many others. And it's embraced by every generation. It's viewed as really cool, really rare. And yet they have done nothing to market themselves. That you can only buy them at one tiny shop. The shop itself is not the most interesting looking. The staff is notoriously cold and standoffish. And yet they maintain this level of interest. So I don't think that they are looking to grow or looking to, advertise in any way or wholesale. And it's pretty interesting that, a brand that can remain so restrained is gaining such popularity and has, maintained it over time, and even turning down, Chanel when they wanted to buy the brand, which is, quite incredible.
And is it equally popular among men and women?
It's definitely embraced more by men, I would say. I think it's gaining popularity with women. And then you have, these beautiful old images of Kate Moss wearing them and everything else. But it's more of a menswear thing. Michael, as you know, from attending Pitti Uomo in Italy and the men's shows, menswear guys are pretty obsessed with Belgian loafers and kind of fighting over rare pairs or custom pairs gone wrong on eBay. The shoes are almost so discreet and so beautifully made that you really don't notice them, and it's kind of a triple look shoe. But I think that it communicates more of, this level of confidence that, guys have now.
Well, Emily, thank you so much. This is such a fun story, and I'm so glad that we now know exactly why this trend has taken off in such a way.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, moving on. We have one of my favorite writers. We hate to pick favorites here, but when it comes to theater critics, there's no one quite like John Lahr. And John is here to explain exactly what went wrong and right, perhaps, with the new theatrical adaptation of Dr. Strangelove. John is a columnist at Airmail. He's the first critic to ever win a Tony Award for co-authoring Elaine Stritch at Liberty, and we are delighted to have him. Welcome, John.
It's nice to be here.
Your most recent escapade to the theater took you to see Iannucci's adaptation of Stanley Kubrick's film, Dr. Strangelove. How did you find it?
Well, I think we all know the film very well. I mean, it's usually considered one of the 100 best American films, or probably best films ever made. It's really wonderful. And so I was anticipating it. As a sort of piece of theater going, it seems to have everything going for it. It's a great story, and the stage version had Armando Iannucci co-adapting the piece, and he's responsible for a lot of wonderful British satire in The Loop. Well, and he wrote Veep. He was the showrunner of Veep. So a lot of expectation there. And of course, Steve Coogan is in England and I guess worldwide because of his film work. For the last 20 years, has been a kind of one of the stellar comedians. So there's a lot of expectation around this show. And I imagine it's built as a commercial vehicle. The expectation was a musical. It's going to be started here and go the route of West End to Broadway. So although my expectations were high, it was interesting to see the play within the context, both of which is still under the threat of nuclear annihilation, but also a kind of surround and a sense of horror, which is almost more visceral than the nuclear cloud. And what was interesting was the difference between the stage and film. In the film, the film is dominated by this spectacular set that Kubrick invented, with this behemoth war room, this large elliptical space with great neon lights above it, and the walls filled with the trajectories of all the planes that are out there and spying on people. Anyway, it's wonderful. And they've tried to duplicate in adapting the film to the stage. They've stuck to the same sort of architectural plan. But the problem is actually visual, that this war room where most of the events take place is actually so big that the actors are pressed to the side of the stage, can't find it very hard to sort of seize and fill the space and speak over the table. You start to appreciate the nuance and fine filigree of close-ups and wide angles and the visual variety that you got in the film, which you cannot have on stage. And since what you're looking at is a farce, the whole point of farce is the engine is speed. The stage productions, for all the sort of talent on view, it's sluggish. It takes too long. There's not enough air and oxygen in it. And, the audience enjoyed it. They know a lot of the lines by heart. But one of the things Iannucci has said in a New York Times interview was that the actual film dialogue would be the equivalent of 45 minutes of stage dialogue. And this stage show runs a little over 2 hours. It's word heavy and action short. And so although there's an awful lot of talent on stage, the simulacrum of the show, it doesn't really work in the way that one imagines. I have a personal gripe against which is the sort of template of contemporary musicals. I understand in a sense why it's done, but the idea of adapting a movie for the stage is, I think, really retrograde. By replicating this other story, it doesn't take an audience on the ride that real theater art should, I think. I would argue. Take you.
I mean, John, this is part of a broader trend that we're seeing in the theater, right? Of more commercial instincts often prevailing. Do you have any other examples of that you want to talk about?
When, you're seeing all the Catch Me If You Can was an example. I mean, there are any number of Pretty Woman, Legally Blonde, and on and on. I understand it's show business, as Woody Allen said. If it wasn't business, they'd call it show. But the reality is that although it makes money, it's retrograde in the sense that it doesn't push the form farther or take the audiences to places, generally speaking. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, where they don't go. The musicals that have succeeded in terms of both art and business to a degree are the Sondheim shows or Rent or, as I said, Hamilton. I mean, there are exceptions, but the impulse to just take a movie, which gives you a plot, and get an audience to go and see what they know is a very, very conservative one. And
is there something you've seen that's open this fall there that you're excited about?
Oh, absolutely. There is, I would say, a great play that opened this fall called Giant, written by a first-time playwright, but a man who's of the theater, Mark Rosenblatt, which was done at the Royal Court, directed by Nick Heitner, which is absolutely wonderful. It's a play about Roald Dahl, and it's a contrived, partially true and partially imagined. Roald Dahl made some anti-Semitic comments, printed some anti-Semitic comments in a book review back in the 50s. And the author has contrived a situation based on this truth where his American and his English publishers arrive to convince him to massage his statements. This is just at the time that his very wonderful story book, The Witches, is about to come out. They want him to massage his statements and say something to take the heat off him and the new book. They're really essentially protecting their investment. But the thing is, the two publishers are both Jewish. So it becomes an argument which we can't have at the moment. It opens up the whole discussion about the anti-Semitism, the Middle East, and it deals with Dahl's absolute, in both his arrogance and his wit, and it's an absolutely thrilling performance by John Lithgow, who plays him. And it's absolutely a textbook performance. It's a wonderful performance. The show, I'm sure it will transfer to the West End and ultimately come to New York. I mean, it's that good. For me, I haven't seen a play that takes just exactly what I was talking about before, that takes an audience to a new place where they can hear things that haven't been allowed to be discussed in the culture, really, and think about things from a different way. I mean, Dahl was a terrible man. I mean, really arrogant. He was fired by Knopf. This is a man who sold 300 million copies of his books, and who so recently, in 2018, the family estate sold his catalog to Netflix for $1 billion. But even so, Knopf fired him because of it was insulting, high-handed behavior. They couldn't stand it. So you're faced dramatically with this very witty and ironic presence dueling with all these other, I have to say, Jewish entrepreneurs as he's imagined. And it's just thrilling theater.
Well, John, thank you so much. We not only love reading about the plays that you love, but we also love reading about the ones that you're not as keen on, because only in your words do you bring all of them to life so vividly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks for all the recommendations.
Good. Well, thank you.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
All right, well, it is the weekend, and we know that we are not going to be flocking to this theater to see Dr. Strangelove, Michael, but I know you've got something you can recommend to us.
I do, and after the week that was, and maybe the year so far, I suggest it's time to take a break from all the screens you've been looking at and get out and see some culture in person, like a museum, wherever you are. And if you live in New York City, I suggest two great shows to see. The first is at MoMA. It's a centenary exhibition of the photographer Robert Frank, the artist revered for his groundbreaking and masterpiece book, The Americans. And this is a show that makes a case for a lot of his later work. I think it's beautiful and powerful, so don't miss it. Then, going from the 20th century to the 14th century, over at the Metropolitan Museum, they have a show called Siena, The Rise of Painting, 1300 to 1350, that has brought together, for the first time, a lot of rarely seen works that set the stage for the Renaissance. This show is transcendent. It's filled with paintings that just mesmerize you and kind of ask you to just linger and look. And if you do, you find you're sort of brought to maybe a place of timelessness and possibly eternity, which I think is kind of just the vibe you need right now. And you, my dear, what do you have?
Can we please talk about the Martha Stewart documentary on Netflix?
Brooke has been on me to watch it. I said, we'll do it this weekend, so you've gotten ahead of us. Am I supposed to be grouchy about it, like Martha herself, or where do we fall? What do we need to know?
Well, I first read the article in the Times in which she said that she was not a fan of the second half of the documentary. And I thought, I can't believe she's a fan of the first half. I mean, it's not a terribly flattering portrayal. Just as Jennifer Aniston famously said about Brad Pitt, he seemed to have a chip missing. There's an element of humanity that seems to be lacking in Martha. And I don't hold that against her. I think she's, incredibly talented and such a highly visual person. But it struck me as I was watching this documentary that she is the kind of quote unquote celebrity that never would be made in 2024. She came of age in the 90s when we didn't insist on knowing absolutely everything about a person or their personality. Like we sort of let the work in some cases stand for itself. And she did have an incredible eye and aesthetic and was pioneering a lot of new ideas about what it meant to create a home in all of its incarnations. But she's not a terribly likable or even kind of humane or human person. At least it doesn't seem that way in the documentary. And it's fascinating. I just kind of love how she continues to reinvent herself and have all of these acts. I'm not sure that this documentary is going to serve to make her more popular among members of among Gen Z, right? It's going to be important for her trajectory to continue on the path that she's been going on, like with Snoop and, making herself so relevant on Instagram and social media. But, once you sort of get a very clear glimpse at the woman behind all of that, I don't know how relatable she is. I also love how she's still so scarred by the dissolution of her marriage nearly 40 years ago. I mean, that was also fascinating to me that holding on to these things that happened so long ago and still letting that be such a part of her story, at least in this documentary, it was fascinating. It's like she's had so many accomplishments and so many big things have happened since then that the fact that, her husband's cheating on her or so-called cheating on her or whatever is still such a big part of her headspace was fascinating. Anyway, highly recommend it. It's called Martha on Netflix. On that note, we thank you all so much for joining us. Michael, will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thanks again for joining us.